I married my husband's identical twin by mistake, and he let me believe it for 6 months. There are moments in your life when everything you thought was real shatters like glass. When the person you wake up next to, the person you've made love to, the person you've whispered your deepest secrets to in the dark, suddenly becomes a stranger. When you realize that the hands that have touched you, the lips that have kissed you, the voice that has said I love you 1,000 times, belong to someone else entirely. That moment came for me on a Tuesday afternoon in October, when I found a driver's license in a jacket pocket, a license with my husband's face, but not my husband's name. And that's when I understood. The man I'd been sleeping with for 6 months, the man I'd cried with and laughed with and built a life with, wasn't my husband. He was his identical twin brother, and he'd known the whole time. My husband's name is Daniel, or at least, that's what I thought. We met 3 years ago at a coffee shop in Brooklyn. One of those small, cramped places with exposed brick and pretentious latte art and baristas who looked like they were in indie bands. I was working on my laptop, trying to meet a deadline for a freelance article I was writing. He sat down at the table next to mine. Our eyes met. He smiled. Not one of those practiced, pick-up smiles. Something genuine. Something that made my stomach flip in that stupid, adolescent way I thought I'd outgrown. We started talking. About everything. About nothing. About the weather and the terrible coffee and the book I was reading and the work he did as an architect. Hours passed like minutes. When I finally looked at my phone, it was dark outside. I'd missed my deadline. And I didn't care, because I'd met someone who made me feel like I was the only person in the world. Someone who looked at me like I mattered, like I was seen. We dated for 8 months before he proposed. It was perfect. Romantic. He took me to the Brooklyn Bridge at sunset, got down on one knee, said all the right things about forever and partnership and building a life together. I said yes before he even finished asking. We got married 6 months later. Small ceremony, just family and close friends. His parents came, his sister, a few cousins, but not his brother, not Ethan. Daniel told me Ethan was overseas, working on some construction project in Singapore, that he couldn't make it back in time, that he'd sent his congratulations, but travel was complicated and expensive, and he was sorry he'd miss it. I remember feeling disappointed. I'd never met Ethan. Daniel had mentioned him a few times, said they were twins, identical twins, but that they weren't close, that they'd grown up competing for everything and had eventually just drifted apart. Different cities, different lives, different choices. I didn't push. Everyone has complicated family dynamics. I understood. The first year of marriage was everything I'd hoped it would be. Daniel was attentive, loving, present. He'd come home from work and wrap his arms around me from behind while I was cooking dinner. He'd leave little notes in my purse or on the bathroom mirror. Sweet things, silly things, inside jokes that made me smile when I found them hours later. We made love like we were still discovering each other, like every touch was new, like we couldn't get enough. He knew exactly how I liked to be kissed, exactly where to touch me, exactly what to whisper in my ear to make me lose control. It was intoxicating, perfect, or so I thought. Looking back now, I wonder if I was so caught up in the fantasy of it all, the idea of being deeply, passionately in love, that I missed the signs, the small inconsistencies, the moments when something felt slightly off, but I convinced myself I was imagining it. It started about 18 months into our marriage. Small things. Daniel seemed different. Not in any way I could put my finger on. Just different. He'd always been a morning person, up before dawn, making coffee, going for runs. But suddenly he was sleeping in, staying up late. His routine changed. He started drinking scotch. Daniel had never been much of a drinker. Maybe a beer with dinner, wine on special occasions. But now he'd pour himself 2 fingers of scotch every night and sit in the living room, staring at nothing. When I asked if everything was okay, he'd smile and say work was stressful, that he was fine, that he just needed to decompress. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He was my husband, the person I trusted most in the world. But then other things started changing too. The way he kissed me, it was more urgent, more desperate, like he was trying to prove something, like he was hungry for something he wasn't getting. The way he touched me in bed, more confident, more demanding. It should have felt good. It did feel good, but it also felt different, foreign, like I was with someone who knew my body but was discovering it for the first time. I told myself I was overthinking it, that people change, that relationships evolve, that after 1.5 years together, of course things would feel different, deeper, more intense. But then came the night that should have been my first real clue. We were at dinner with my best friend, Lisa, and her husband. Casual, low-key, just the 4 of us at our Italian restaurant we'd been to 12 times before. Lisa was telling a story about our college days, about the time we'd driven to Cape Cod for spring break and gotten lost for 6 hours because I'd insisted I didn't need GPS. Daniel laughed. But it was the wrong laugh. Too loud, too performative. And then Lisa looked at him and said something like, "Remember when we told you this story at our wedding?" And Daniel froze, just for a second, just long enough for me to notice. And then he recovered and said, "Of course, yeah, hilarious story." And the moment passed. But I saw it, that flicker of confusion, that split second where he didn't know what she was talking about. I should have said something. Should have asked him about it later. But I didn't, because acknowledging it would mean admitting something was wrong. And I wasn't ready to do that. The changes continued. He started calling me different pet names. Daniel had always called me sweetheart. Every morning. Every night. "Hey, sweetheart, how was your day?" "Good night, sweetheart, I love you." But now he was calling me babe. Baby. Beautiful. Names that felt generic. Impersonal. Like he was testing them out, seeing which one fit. His taste in food changed too. Daniel hated cilantro. Absolutely hated it. Would pick it out of everything. Made a face if he even smelled it. But one night I made tacos and accidentally added cilantro to the salsa, and he ate it without a word. Didn't even notice. When I mentioned it, he just shrugged and said maybe his taste buds had changed. That it happens sometimes. And I let it go. Because what was I supposed to say? "You're not acting like yourself. You're acting like a different person?" That would have sounded insane. So I stayed quiet, and the distance between us grew. Then came the sex. God, the sex. It had always been good with Daniel. Comfortable. Familiar. We knew each other's bodies. Knew what worked. What didn't. It was safe. Satisfying. But about 4 months into these changes, something shifted. He became different in bed. More aggressive. More experimental. He'd do things he'd never done before. Touch me in ways he'd never touched me. Say things he'd never said. Darker things. Dirtier things. Things that made me gasp and grip the sheets and forget my own name. It was incredible. Mind-blowing. But also confusing. Because this wasn't the Daniel I'd married. This was someone else. Someone who knew exactly what to do to make me fall apart. Someone who seemed to enjoy watching me lose control. Someone who would whisper in my ear afterward while I was still trembling, still catching my breath, and say things like I've wanted to do that for so long. Or you have no idea how long I've been thinking about this. And I thought he meant us. Our marriage. Our relationship. I thought he was saying he'd been wanting to take our intimacy to a new level. But now I know what he really meant. He'd been watching, waiting, wanting me, not as Daniel's wife, but as something he couldn't have, until he could. 5 months into the changes, I started having doubts I couldn't ignore. I'd catch him staring at me sometimes with this look in his eyes, like he was memorizing me, like he was afraid I'd disappear. Like he knew something I didn't. I'd ask him what he was thinking and he'd smile and say nothing, just that he loved me. But it felt like a lie, like he was hiding something, like every word out of his mouth was carefully chosen, calculated. I started paying closer attention, started watching him the way he watched me, and I noticed things, small things. His handwriting was slightly different. Daniel had always written in neat, architectural block letters, but now his handwriting was messier, more rushed. His laugh was different too. Daniel had a quiet laugh, almost a chuckle, but this laugh was fuller, louder, more unguarded. Even the way he walked was different. Daniel had always moved with purpose, efficient, direct, but now there was a looseness to his movements, a confidence that bordered on arrogance. It was like watching someone wear a costume that fit almost perfectly, but not quite. I started questioning everything. Was I losing my mind? Was I so desperate to find problems in my marriage that I was inventing them? Was this just what happened after the honeymoon phase ended? Did everyone go through this? Did everyone wake up one day and feel like they didn't quite recognize the person sleeping next to them? I thought about talking to someone, a therapist, a friend. But what would I say? My husband seems different. He's more passionate, more attentive, more exciting in bed, and I'm complaining about it. It sounded ridiculous, ungrateful, like I was sabotaging my own happiness because I couldn't accept that things were actually good. So I stayed quiet, and I let it continue. Let him kiss me, touch me, make love to me, all while this tiny voice in the back of my head kept whispering something's wrong, something's wrong, something's wrong. 6 months after the changes started, I found the license. It was a Saturday. Daniel, or whoever he was, had gone out to meet a client. Said he'd be back in a few hours. I was doing laundry, going through pockets before throwing clothes in the wash. It's habit. Checking for receipts, loose change, chapstick, whatever. And in the pocket of his jacket, the navy one he'd been wearing all week, I found a wallet. Not his usual wallet. A different one. Cheaper. Worn. Like a backup. I opened it, and there it was. A driver's license. With Daniel's face. Same eyes. Same nose. Same jawline. Same everything. But the name on the license wasn't Daniel Michael Porter. It was Ethan James Porter, his twin brother, the one who was supposed to be in Singapore, the one I'd never met, the one who hadn't come to our wedding. I stared at that license for what felt like hours, my brain trying to make sense of what I was seeing, trying to find an explanation that didn't shatter my entire reality. Maybe it was an old license. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for why my husband had his brother's ID in his pocket. But I knew, deep down, in a place that can't be reasoned with or rationalized away, I knew. The man I'd been living with for the past 6 months wasn't Daniel. It was Ethan. And somehow, some way, he'd taken Daniel's place. And I hadn't noticed, hadn't known, hadn't suspected anything until it was too late. Until I'd already fallen into bed with him. Until I'd already told him I loved him. Until I'd already given him parts of myself I'd only ever given to Daniel. I sat down on the bathroom floor, license still in my hand, and I felt my entire world collapse. Because if this was true, if the man I'd been kissing and touching and making love to for half a year wasn't my husband, then where was Daniel? What had happened to him? And why had Ethan done this? Why had he pretended to be someone else? Why had he let me believe I was with my husband when I wasn't? Why had he looked me in the eyes and said I love you knowing it was all a lie? I don't know how long I sat there. Minutes. Hours. Time felt meaningless. Eventually, I heard the front door open. Heard footsteps. Heard his voice calling out my name. Hey, beautiful, I'm back. That name. Beautiful. Not sweetheart. Because he wasn't Daniel. He was Ethan. And he'd been lying to me this entire time. I stood up, walked out of the bathroom, down the hallway, into the living room where he was taking off his jacket. The same jacket, the one with the wallet, with the license. He looked up, saw my face, and I watched as something shifted in his expression. Recognition, understanding, fear. He knew. He knew I'd found it, and there was nowhere left to hide. I held up the license, my hand shaking, my voice barely a whisper. I asked him one question, the only question that mattered. Who are you? He didn't answer right away, just stood there, staring at me. And for the first time since this had all started, since the moment 6 months ago when everything had changed, I saw him. Really saw him. Not as Daniel, not as my husband, but as someone else. Someone who'd been pretending. Someone who'd been playing a role. Someone who'd been living a lie. And I realized with a sickening clarity that I didn't know him at all. This man I'd shared my bed with. This man I'd trusted. This man I'd loved. He was a stranger. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and then, finally he spoke. And what he said made everything so much worse. He said, "I'm sorry." He said, "I never meant for it to go this far." He said, "I did it for you." And then he said the words that made my blood run cold. He said, "Daniel asked me to." I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what he just said. Daniel asked him to? Asked him to what? To pretend to be him? To sleep with his wife? To lie to me for 6 months? Nothing made sense. Nothing added up. I demanded answers, demanded the truth. And slowly, piece by piece, Ethan told me everything. He told me that Daniel had been sick, really sick. A brain tumor they discovered 18 months ago. Right around the time I'd noticed the changes, Daniel had been getting treatment, surgery, radiation, chemotherapy, but it wasn't working. The tumor was growing, and Daniel knew he was dying, knew he didn't have much time left, and he'd made a decision he hadn't told me about, a decision that would change everything. He'd asked Ethan to take his place, to step into his life, to be the husband I deserved, to love me the way Daniel couldn't anymore. Because Daniel was too weak, too sick, too consumed by the disease eating away at his brain. And he couldn't bear the thought of me watching him deteriorate, couldn't bear the thought of me seeing him fade away. So he'd asked Ethan to do the impossible, to become him. And Ethan had agreed. I felt like I was going to be sick. My legs gave out. I sank onto the couch. Ethan sat down across from me. Not close, giving me space. And he kept talking, kept explaining. He said Daniel had coached him, told him everything, every detail of our relationship, every story, every inside joke, every habit, every preference. He taught Ethan how to be Daniel, and Ethan had studied, had practiced, had become someone else so completely that even I, the person who knew Daniel better than anyone, hadn't been able to tell the difference. Or at least, hadn't wanted to see it. Ethan said Daniel had watched from a distance for the first few weeks, made sure Ethan was doing it right, made sure I wasn't suspicious, and then, when he was sure it was working, Daniel had left. Checked himself into a facility upstate, a hospice, where he could die quietly, peacefully, without me having to watch, without me having to suffer. He'd thought he was protecting me, thought he was giving me a gift, the gift of not having to say goodbye. But he'd also taken everything from me. He'd taken my choice, my agency, my right to be with my husband in his final days. He decided, without asking me, without giving me a say, that I was better off being lied to, better off being with his brother, better off not knowing. And Ethan had gone along with it, had stepped into Daniel's life, into Daniel's bed, into Daniel's marriage, and he'd stayed there for 6 months, pretending, lying, touching me with hands that weren't my husband's, kissing me with lips that had never said wedding vows, making love to me while Daniel was dying alone in some facility I didn't even know existed. I looked at Ethan, really looked at him, and I saw the guilt in his eyes, the shame, but I also saw something else, something that made my stomach turn, desire, want, love. He'd fallen for me. Somewhere in the past 6 months, while he was pretending to be Daniel, while he was playing the role of my husband, he'd fallen in love with me. And I'd fallen for him too. Not knowingly, not intentionally, but I had, because the man I'd been with for the past 6 months, the man who'd made me feel alive and desired and loved, that wasn't Daniel. That was Ethan. And some part of me had known. Some part of me had felt it, had responded to it, had wanted it. I asked the question I was terrified to hear the answer to. I asked where Daniel was now. Ethan looked down at his hands. And I knew, before he even said the words, I knew. Daniel was gone. He died 3 weeks ago. Quietly, in his sleep, the way he'd wanted. And Ethan hadn't told me, hadn't let me go to the funeral, hadn't given me the chance to say goodbye, because Daniel had made him promise, had made him swear that he'd keep up the charade, that he'd continue being Daniel, that he'd take care of me, that he'd love me, that he'd make sure I never felt alone. And Ethan had kept that promise, even after Daniel died, even knowing it was wrong, even knowing that eventually, inevitably, I'd find out. He kept lying, kept pretending, kept being someone he wasn't, because he loved me, and he didn't know how to stop. I stood up, walked to the window, stared out at the street below, cars passing, people walking, life continuing like nothing had changed, like my entire existence hadn't just been revealed as a lie. I thought about the past 6 months, every kiss, every touch, every whispered I love you. All of it had been with Ethan, not Daniel. My husband had been dying, had died, and I'd been in bed with his brother, a man I'd never even met before he started pretending to be someone else. A man who'd stolen my husband's identity, my husband's life, my husband's wife, and I'd let him. I'd enjoyed it. I'd fallen for it. I'd wanted it. And that realization, that understanding of my own complicity in this nightmare was what broke me. I started crying, not gentle tears, violent, body-shaking sobs that made it hard to breathe. Ethan moved toward me, reached out, and I recoiled, told him not to touch me, told him to get out, told him I never wanted to see him again. He stood there for a moment, looking at me with those eyes. Daniel's eyes, but not Daniel's eyes. And then he nodded, said he understood, said he was sorry, said he knew he'd ruined everything. And then he left, just walked out the door, left me standing in the apartment we'd shared, the life we'd built, the lie we'd been living. And I was alone, completely, utterly alone. My husband was dead, had been dead for weeks, and I hadn't known, hadn't mourned, hadn't been there, because I'd been too busy falling in love with someone else, someone who looked exactly like him, but wasn't him, would never be him. I sank to the floor, wrapped my arms around myself, and I screamed until my throat was raw, until I had nothing left, because everything I thought I knew was gone. Everything I thought was real was a lie, and I didn't know how to come back from that. Didn't know how to piece myself back together. Didn't know who I even was anymore. Was I Daniel's widow? Ethan's lover? Both. Neither. I didn't have answers. I just had questions, and pain, and a grief so deep it felt like drowning. I don't know how long I stayed on that floor. hours, maybe the whole night. At some point the room went dark, and I didn't bother turning on lights. I just sat there in the emptiness, replaying every moment of the last 6 months. Every conversation, every touch, every time I'd looked into those eyes and thought I was seeing my husband. Every time I'd felt that flicker of something's different and pushed it away. Every time my body had responded to Ethan's touch in ways it had never responded to Daniel's. And that was the part that destroyed me most. Not that I'd been deceived, but that somewhere, somehow, I'd preferred the deception to the reality. The passionate, intense, all-consuming version of my marriage that Ethan had given me was better than what I'd had with Daniel. And admitting that, even just to myself, felt like the ultimate betrayal. When the sun came up, I finally moved. Went to the bathroom. Looked at myself in the mirror. I looked like someone else. Hollow. Broken. A stranger wearing my face. I splashed water on my skin. Brushed my teeth. Went through the motions of being human, even though I felt like I'd stopped existing somewhere in the night. And then I did something I hadn't expected to do. I called Ethan. He answered on the first ring. Like he'd been waiting. Like he'd been holding his phone all night hoping I'd reach out. His voice was rough, exhausted. He said my name like a question, like he couldn't believe I was actually calling. I asked him where Daniel was buried. I needed to know, needed to see it, needed to make it real. Because right now it felt like another lie, another trick, another layer of deception I couldn't untangle. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he gave me an address, a cemetery in Westchester. He offered to take me there. I said no, said I needed to go alone. He understood, said he'd leave Daniel's things for me, said there were letters, things Daniel had written before he died, things he'd wanted me to have, things Ethan had been holding on to, waiting for the right time to give them to me. I hung up without saying goodbye. I drove to Westchester that morning. The cemetery was small, quiet, beautiful in that peaceful, melancholy way cemeteries are. I found Daniel's grave easily, fresh, the headstone simple. Daniel Michael Porter, beloved husband, the dates. I stood there staring at those dates, and I realized Daniel had been dead for 3 weeks. 3 weeks during which I'd been living with Ethan, sleeping next to him, making love to him, laughing with him, planning our future, while my husband was in the ground. I knelt down in the grass, pressed my hand against the cold stone, and I talked to him, told him I was angry, furious, that he'd had no right to make this decision for me, no right to take away my choice. No right to decide that I was better off being lied to than being with him through the hardest thing he'd ever faced. I told him I would have stayed, would have held his hand, would have been there every single day, no matter how hard it got. Because that's what marriage means. That's what love means. Not protection, not sparing someone pain, but being present, being honest, being real, even when it's ugly, even when it hurts. Even when it's the hardest thing you've ever done. But then as I sat there in the grass talking to a headstone, something shifted in me. Because I started to understand why Daniel had done it. Not agree with it. Not forgive it. But understand it. Daniel had always been a protector. Always wanted to fix things. Always wanted to make sure everyone around him was okay. And facing his own death, facing the reality that he was leaving me, must have been unbearable. Must have felt like failing at the one job he'd given himself. Taking care of me. So he'd found a solution. A terrible, misguided, selfish solution. But a solution nonetheless. He'd given me a version of himself that wasn't dying. That could still love me fully. That could still be the husband he wanted to be, but physically couldn't anymore. He'd given me Ethan. And Ethan had tried. God, Ethan had tried. He'd studied Daniel's life like it was a script. Learned every line, every gesture, every nuance, and he performed it beautifully, so beautifully that I believed it. But it wasn't just performance. Somewhere in the process of becoming Daniel, Ethan had also become himself. The passion, the intensity, the way he touched me like he'd been starving for it, that wasn't Daniel. That was Ethan. His desire, his love, his need, and I'd responded to it, not because I thought it was Daniel, but because it was real. Because Ethan's feelings for me, however wrong the circumstances, were genuine. I went home, and I read Daniel's letters. There were 7 of them, each one dated, each one written during different stages of his illness. The first one was from right after his diagnosis, before he'd told Ethan about his plan, before he'd set any of this in motion. It was raw, terrified. He wrote about how he didn't want to die, how he wasn't ready, how he'd been planning our future, thinking about kids, thinking about growing old together. And now none of that was possible. He wrote about how much he loved me, how the thought of leaving me was worse than the thought of dying, how he'd do anything, to make sure I was okay. The second letter was from after his first surgery, when the doctors told him it hadn't worked, that the tumor was too aggressive, that he had months, maybe a year if he was lucky. This letter was when he first mentioned Ethan, said he'd been thinking about his brother, about how they looked identical but had always been so different, about how Ethan had always been the passionate one, the reckless one, the one who felt everything too deeply. And Daniel wondered what it would be like if Ethan could give me what Daniel couldn't anymore. The love, the attention, the physical intimacy that Daniel's failing body was making impossible. The third letter was where Daniel laid out his plan. He talked to Ethan, explained the situation, asked him to do the unthinkable. And Ethan had said yes. Daniel wrote that he knew it was wrong, knew it was insane, knew I'd hate him if I ever found out. But he couldn't bear the alternative, couldn't bear me watching him waste away, couldn't bear me sacrificing years of my life to care for someone who was already gone. He said he was giving me a gift. The gift of not having to suffer. The gift of continuity. The gift of a husband who could still be a husband in all the ways that mattered. He said Ethan would take care of me, would love me, would be everything Daniel wanted to be but couldn't. And that brought Daniel peace, knowing I wouldn't be alone, knowing I'd be loved, even if it was a lie, even if it was wrong. It was better than the truth. The fourth letter was from 2 months later. Daniel wrote about watching Ethan prepare, watching him study, watching him transform into a version of Daniel that was somehow better than the original. He wrote about feeling jealous, and relieved, and grateful, and ashamed, all at once. He said Ethan was doing an incredible job, that even Daniel himself was starting to forget where he ended and Ethan began. He said he'd seen us together once, had driven by the apartment, had watched through the window as Ethan kissed me goodbye before leaving for work. And Daniel said it looked right, natural, real, like that's how it was always supposed to be. The fifth letter was from a month before Daniel died. His handwriting was shakier, harder to read. He wrote about how weak he'd gotten, how the pain was constant, how he was ready to go, but he was scared, not of death, of me finding out, of me hating him, of me never forgiving him for what he'd done. He said he hoped I'd understand someday, that I'd see he'd done it out of love, not to hurt me, not to betray me, but to protect me, to give me a version of our life together that didn't end with him in a hospital bed, unrecognizable, unable to speak, unable to be himself. He said this way I'd have good memories, happy memories, memories of a marriage that stayed strong until the end, even if the end wasn't real. The sixth letter was from a week before he died. Just a few lines. He said he loved me, that he'd always loved me, that everything he'd done was because he couldn't imagine a world where I wasn't happy. And if lying to me, if deceiving me, if giving me to his brother was what it took to ensure that happiness, then he'd do it again. He said he was sorry, but not sorry enough to regret it. And he hoped that meant something. The seventh letter was different. It wasn't from Daniel. It was from Ethan, written the day after Daniel died. He said he'd promised Daniel he'd never tell me the truth, that he'd keep being Daniel for as long as I'd let him, that he'd love me and take care of me and never let me know what had happened. But Ethan also said he couldn't keep that promise. Not forever. Not when every time he touched me, every time he kissed me, every time he looked into my eyes and said, "I love you," he knew he was living a lie. He said he'd fallen in love with me. Deeply. Completely. Irrevocably. And that made everything worse. Because he wasn't supposed to fall in love. He was supposed to play a role. Be a stand-in. A substitute. But you can't fake passion. Can't fake desire. Can't fake the way his heart raced every time I walked into a room. Can't fake the way he wanted to memorize every inch of my skin. Can't fake the way he felt like he'd been waiting his whole life to meet me, and when he finally did, he had to pretend to be someone else. Ethan wrote that the past 6 months had been the best and worst of his life. Best because he got to be with me. Worst because he knew it was temporary. Knew that eventually I'd find out. Knew that when I did, I'd hate him. And he'd lose me. And that loss would destroy him. I sat with those letters for days. Read them over and over. Tried to make sense of what Daniel and Ethan had done. Tried to figure out how I felt. And slowly, terrifyingly, I realized something. I wasn't just angry. I was heartbroken. But not just because Daniel had died. I was heartbroken because I'd lost Ethan too. The man I'd spent the last 6 months with. The man who'd made me feel more alive than I'd felt in years. The man whose touch set my skin on fire. Whose kiss made me forget everything else. Whose love, even though it was built on deception, had felt more real than anything I'd ever experienced. That man was gone. Because once I knew the truth, once I knew he was Ethan and not Daniel, everything changed. The magic disappeared. The fantasy shattered. And I was left with the complicated, messy, impossible reality. I'd been in love with 2 men, my husband and his brother, and I'd lost them both. 3 weeks after I found the license, Ethan showed up at my door. I hadn't called him, hadn't reached out, hadn't known what to say. But there he was, standing in the hallway, looking like Daniel, but not Daniel. Looking like himself. He asked if he could come in. I said yes. We sat across from each other in the living room. The same room where I'd confronted him. The same room where everything had fallen apart. He spoke first. Said he'd been staying with a friend. Giving me space. Trying to figure out what to do next. He said he'd thought about leaving. Moving to another city. Disappearing. Making it easier for both of us. But he couldn't, because he needed me to know something. Something he hadn't said that night. Something he should have said from the beginning. He said that yes, Daniel had asked him to do this. Yes, he'd agreed to help his dying brother. Yes, he'd stepped into Daniel's life with the intention of just playing a role. But the moment he met me, the moment he looked into my eyes for the first time, not through Daniel's memories, but through his own experience, everything changed. He said he'd felt it immediately. A connection. A pull. Something that made him understand why Daniel had fought so hard to stay alive. Why Daniel had loved me so completely. Because I was extraordinary. And Ethan had fallen. Not slowly. Not gradually. Instantly. And every day after that had been torture. Because he got to be with me. Got to touch me. Got to love me. But only by pretending to be someone else. He said the past 6 months had shown him what his life could be. What love could feel like. What it meant to wake up next to someone and feel complete. And now that it was over, now that I knew the truth, he understood he'd never have that again. Because the only woman he'd ever loved, the only woman he'd ever want was me. And he destroyed any chance we might have had by lying to me, by being part of Daniel's deception, by taking something that should have been honest and pure and turning it into something complicated and wrong. He said he was sorry, not for loving me, but for how he'd loved me, for the circumstances, for the pain he'd caused. He said if he could go back, if he could do it differently, he would. He'd have told me the truth from the beginning, would have introduced himself as Ethan, would have let me grieve Daniel properly. And then if I'd wanted, if I'd felt it too, maybe we could have found our way to each other honestly. But he couldn't go back, couldn't undo what had been done. So all he could do was tell me the truth now, that he loved me, that he'd always loved me, and that he understood if I never wanted to see him again. I listened to him speak, watched the pain in his eyes, the genuine, raw emotion that couldn't be faked or performed. And I felt something crack open inside me, something I'd been holding closed, protecting, because acknowledging it would mean admitting something terrifying. I'd loved Daniel. Of course I had. He'd been my husband, my partner, my best friend. But the man who'd made me feel truly alive, truly seen, truly desired in a way I'd never experienced before, that wasn't Daniel. That was Ethan. And some part of me had known, had felt it, had responded to it. The changes I'd noticed weren't Daniel becoming a different person. They were Ethan being himself. And I'd fallen for him, not because I thought he was Daniel, but because he was Ethan. And that realization, that understanding that I'd been falling in love with someone else while my husband was dying, should have made me feel guilty, should have made me feel like a terrible person. But it didn't, because love isn't something you can control, isn't something you can logic your way into or out of. It just is. It exists. And pretending it doesn't, denying it, pushing it away, that doesn't make it less real. It just makes you miserable. I looked at Ethan, really looked at him, saw him as himself for the first time, not as Daniel's replacement, not as a stand-in, not as a copy, but as Ethan, a man who'd made an impossible choice to help his dying brother, a man who'd sacrificed his own identity to give someone else peace, a man who'd fallen in love despite knowing it would destroy him, a man who'd lived in the shadow of someone else for 6 months just to make sure I wasn't alone. And I realized that while what he'd done was wrong, while the deception was unforgivable by conventional standards, it had also been an act of love. Complicated, messy, flawed, but love nonetheless. And I had a choice. I could hold on to my anger, my sense of betrayal, my grief over Daniel's death, and the way it had been kept from me. I could let those feelings define me, consume me, turn me into someone bitter and closed off and afraid to trust anyone ever again. Or I could acknowledge the impossible truth, that I'd loved 2 men, that I'd lost one, and that the other was sitting across from me, waiting for me to decide if there was any possibility of forgiveness, of understanding, of moving forward. I asked Ethan a question, the question that had been haunting me since I'd read Daniel's letters. I asked him if he regretted it, not the lying, not the deception, but falling in love with me. He didn't hesitate, said no, said loving me was the only real thing in a situation built entirely on pretense. Said even if it meant losing me, even if it meant living with the guilt and the pain and the knowledge that he'd never be able to make it right, he didn't regret it. Because those 6 months with me had shown him what it meant to truly love someone, to want someone's happiness more than your own, to be willing to sacrifice everything just to see them smile. And that wasn't something he'd trade. Not for anything. I nodded, felt tears sliding down my face, asked him one more question, asked him if he thought we could start over, not as Daniel and his wife, not as two people living a lie, but as Ethan and me, two broken people trying to figure out how to move forward from an impossible situation. Two people who'd found something real in the middle of something false. Two people who maybe, just maybe, deserved a chance to see what they could be if they were honest. If they were themselves. Ethan looked at me like I'd just given him something he'd stopped believing he could have. Hope. He said yes. Said he'd do anything for that chance. Said he'd spend the rest of his life making it up to me, earning my trust, being worthy of the love I was offering him. I told him it wouldn't be easy, that I'd probably have moments where I couldn't look at him without seeing Daniel, without remembering the deception, without feeling the loss. I told him I'd need time, space, honesty, complete, unfiltered honesty about everything. No more secrets, no more lies, no matter how hard the truth was. He agreed, said he'd give me whatever I needed, said he'd wait as long as it took, said he wasn't going anywhere. And then, slowly, carefully, like he was afraid I might break, he reached across the space between us and took my hand. And I let him, because despite everything, despite the impossibility of it all, his hand in mine felt right. Felt like coming home. Felt like maybe, just maybe, we could build something real out of the wreckage of everything that had been destroyed. It's been a year since that day. A year of therapy, of long, difficult conversations, of crying and fighting and working through the layers of trauma and grief and guilt that came with what happened. A year of Ethan proving, every single day, that he was committed to being honest, to being himself, to loving me as Ethan, not as a copy of someone else. And slowly, painfully, beautifully, we've built something new. Something that's ours. Not Daniel's. Not a continuation of my marriage, but a completely different relationship. One built on truth, on choice, on the understanding that love doesn't always come in the neat, acceptable packages we expect. Sometimes it comes in the most complicated, painful, impossible ways. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to acknowledge it, to fight for it, to let it exist despite all the reasons it shouldn't, it becomes the most real thing you've ever experienced. I still think about Daniel, still miss him, still grieve the life we could have had if cancer hadn't stolen him from me. But I also understand now what he was trying to do. He was giving me permission to move on, to be happy, to love again. He just didn't realize I'd end up loving the person he chose to take his place. Ethan and I got married last month. Small ceremony, just us and a handful of people who knew our story, who understood the complicated, messy journey that had brought us here. It felt right, not like replacing Daniel, but like honoring what he'd wanted for me. A life full of love, a life where I wasn't alone, a life where I was truly, deeply happy. And I am happy in a way I never thought I'd be again. Because Ethan isn't Daniel. He's himself, passionate, intense, unguarded. He loves me in a way that's completely different from how Daniel loved me. And that's okay. That's good. Because I'm different now too. Changed by loss. Changed by deception. Changed by the understanding that life is complicated and love is messy, and sometimes the right person comes into your life in the wrong way. And you have to decide if you're brave enough to let them stay. I chose to let him stay. And every day I choose it again. Because love isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, being honest, being present, even when it's hard, even when it's painful, even when the world tells you it's wrong. Ethan, and I know our story will make people uncomfortable. We'll make them judge us. We'll make them question how we could possibly build a life together after what happened. But we also know something they don't. We know what it's like to love someone so completely that you're willing to become someone else just to keep them from suffering. We know what it's like to fall in love in the most impossible circumstances. And we know what it's like to choose each other every single day, despite everything. That's our truth. Complicated, messy, real, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. So if you've ever loved someone you thought you knew, only to discover they were someone completely different, you understand. If you've ever had to choose between holding on to anger or taking a chance on something impossible, you understand. If you've ever wondered whether love can survive deception, whether trust can be rebuilt, whether happiness is possible after betrayal, I'm here to tell you it is. It's hard. It's painful. It requires more courage than you think you have. But it's possible. And sometimes, the love you find on the other side of the lies is more real than anything you had before. Because it's built on truth, on choice, on the understanding that we're all just broken people trying our best to love each other despite our flaws. Have you ever loved someone who wasn't who you thought they were? Have you ever discovered that the person who hurt you was also the person who saved you? Have you ever had to choose between what's right and what feels true? If this story made you question everything you thought you knew about love, about loyalty, about truth, then share it. Comment your thoughts. Tell me if you think I made the right choice, or if you think I'm living a lie, because maybe I am, or maybe I'm just living the most honest version of my life I've ever known. And maybe that's all any of us can do. Subscribe if you're brave enough to hear more stories like this. Stories that don't have easy answers. Stories that challenge everything you believe about love and marriage and what it means to be faithful. Because the truth is rarely simple. And love is never easy. But it's always, always worth it.